The day the empath stops caring. And I need you to understand something before we go a single word further, because that phrase, stops caring, is going to land wrong for a significant number of people hearing it. And landing wrong is exactly what I wanted to do, because the discomfort of it is the entire point. When most people hear that an empath has stopped caring, the image that forms is one of failure, of someone who tried and finally broke, of warmth curdling into indifference, of sensitivity hardening into numbness, of the most feeling person in every room finally being worn down to a version of themselves that feels nothing at all. And I understand why that image forms, because that is the narrative the world has always attached to the empath who changes, that the change is a loss, that the softness being replaced by something else is a tragedy, that whoever she is becoming is lesser than whoever she was before. But Daniel Goleman, whose work on emotional intelligence gave us the most rigorous and most honest framework we have for understanding what actually happens inside human beings as they develop emotionally, described something in his later research that dismantles that narrative completely. He described a stage of emotional development so advanced, so rare, and so fundamentally misunderstood by almost everyone who witnesses it from the outside that he hesitated, in several interviews, to even call it a stage of caring less. What he called it instead was something that requires everything we are about to discuss to fully understand. He called it the arrival of what he termed equanimity. And equanimity, in the life of an empath, does not look like not caring. It looks like the most terrifying, most liberating, most completely misread transformation a deeply feeling person can undergo. Stay with me, because by the end of this episode, you are going to understand something about the empath in your life, or the empath you are, that changes the entire story of what you thought you were watching. Let's start with what brings her here, because the day the empath stops caring does not arrive from nowhere. It is not a sudden shift, not a decision made in a single moment of clarity, not the result of one specific betrayal or one specific loss, even though there is almost always a specific betrayal or loss that functions as the final catalyst. The day the empath stops caring is the result of an accumulation so long and so thorough that the only appropriate word for what precedes it is a lifetime. A lifetime of feeling everything in rooms that required her to act on what she felt. A lifetime of being the person whose sensitivity was treated as a resource to be drawn from, rather than a quality to be honored. A lifetime of loving people who understood, on some level, that her love was not entirely conditional, that it would continue flowing even when nothing came back in the other direction. That her capacity for understanding and patience and forgiveness was so vast that it could be relied upon to absorb almost anything without producing the kind of rupture that might force genuine accountability. A lifetime of all of that, compounding quietly, building without visible dramatic incident, until one day she sits somewhere, in her car in a parking lot, in her kitchen at 2 a.m, in the middle of a conversation that is asking something of her that she used to be able to give, and realizes, with a clarity that arrives not loudly, but with the absolute quiet authority of something simply and finally true, that she has nothing left to give. Not nothing left today. Not nothing left until she rests and recovers. Nothing left in the way that means something has fundamentally reorganized inside her. Nothing left in the way that means what was there before cannot be restored, because what was there before was not sustainable, was never sustainable, was always going to reach this point, and the only thing that was ever delaying it was the extraordinary endurance of someone who felt too deeply to stop trying. This is the precipice of what Goleman identified as the final stage of emotional awakening. And the reason he was reluctant to name it simply, the reason it required careful framing in his research, is because it occupies a psychological space that almost every cultural narrative we have about caring people gets completely wrong. We are taught, in essentially every framework available to us, religious, moral, psychological, relational, that caring more is always better, that the expansion of empathy, the deepening of compassion, the increasing willingness to feel other people's pain as though it were your own, represents the highest form of human development. And up to a point, Goleman agreed with this. His framework is built on the premise that emotional intelligence, including empathy, is foundational to human flourishing. But what his later research identified, what the popular version of his work almost never discusses because it is too uncomfortable for too many people who benefit from the popular version, is that there is a ceiling to the development of empathy as absorption, a point beyond which more feeling without more discernment does not produce more compassion. It produces more damage to the empath, and eventually, inevitably, to the people she is trying to love through an empty vessel that has been giving since long before it had anything left to give. Goleman called the capacity that develops beyond this ceiling by a name borrowed from Buddhist philosophy, because Western psychology at the time did not have adequate language for it, and that name was equanimity. Not indifference, not the absence of feeling. Something structurally different from both of those. Something that requires careful unpacking, because the difference between equanimity and indifference is the entire difference between the empath who heals and the empath who hardens. Indifference is the absence of caring. It is emotional flatness, the shutdown of a nervous system that has protected itself by closing off the input that was causing the damage. The empath who reaches indifference has not stopped caring because she grew. She has stopped caring because she was broken down far enough that feeling became neurologically unsustainable, and the system did what systems under unsustainable pressure always do. It protected itself by shutting down. This is not what Goleman was describing. Equanimity is something categorically different. It is the state of someone who still feels everything, every undercurrent, every unspoken need, every emotional frequency in every room she enters, but whose relationship to what she feels has fundamentally changed. She is no longer inside the feeling in the way she used to be inside it, drowning in it, driven by it, automatically converted by it into action on behalf of whoever generated it. She is alongside it, present to it, fully aware of it, and completely, quietly, groundedly free to choose what she does with it. That freedom, the freedom to feel without being commanded by the feeling, is what Goleman described as the hallmark of the most emotionally developed human beings on the planet. And it is also what the people around the empath, the ones who were accustomed to her feeling, converting automatically into availability on their behalf, experience as her stopping caring. Because from where they are standing, the practical result looks identical. She felt something. She did not immediately act on it in their service. Therefore, she must not care anymore. The logic is flawless from inside a dynamic that was built on her automatic conversion. It simply fails to account for what is actually happening inside her, which is not less. It is more. More feeling, more awareness, more presence, and for the first time, genuine choice about what all of that produces. And the specific moment this shift completes itself, the day that gives this episode its title, is not the day the feeling stops. It is the day the obligation stops. The day the empath's nervous system finally, after years of treating other people's emotional states as her emergency and her responsibility and her burden to carry, whether she was asked to carry it or not, stops issuing that automatic directive, stops translating your pain into her problem, stops converting her perception of your need into a mandate for her response. The day she can sit across from someone who is suffering, feel the suffering completely and accurately, understand it at depth, and then make a genuine choice, not an automatic reflex, not a guilt-driven obligation, not a compulsive response to the unbearable discomfort of witnessing need without immediately attempting to meet it. A genuine, considered, self-sourced choice about whether and how to engage with what she is feeling. This is the day. This is what Goleman called the final stage of awakening in the emotionally intelligent person, not the development of more feeling, but the development of genuine agency over what the feeling produces. And this day arrives, for the empath, not as a triumph, not as something that feels the way transformation is supposed to feel in the stories we tell about it, not as a sudden clarity or a surge of power or a clean line between before and after. It arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary moment, as the absence of something that has always been there, the absence of the automatic, the silence where the obligation used to live. And standing in that silence for the first time, the empath feels something she does not immediately have a name for, something that takes time to identify precisely because it is so unfamiliar, something she has to sit with carefully before she trusts herself to call it what it actually is. What it actually is peace. And what that peace means for every relationship, every dynamic, every person who has ever stood in the field of her extraordinary feeling and assumed that field would always be available to them on demand. That is exactly where we are going next. That peace, and I want to stay with it for a moment before we move into what it means for everyone around her. Because the empath herself deserves that moment, deserves to have someone slow down long enough to describe what she is actually experiencing rather than immediately pivoting to how everyone else is affected by it. That peace is unlike anything she has felt before. And the reason it is unlike anything she has felt before is not because she has never had peaceful moments, never had days of quiet, never had periods where the weight was temporarily lighter. She has had all of those things. But they were always temporary in a specific way. They were the peace of a pause between demands, the peace of a moment where nobody needed anything, the peace of an absence of input rather than a genuine internal stillness. What she is feeling now is different in its architecture. It does not depend on the external circumstances being quiet. It does not evaporate the moment someone enters the room with a need, the moment a message arrives with an implicit request, the moment she perceives someone else's pain moving through the air toward her. It stays. Not because she has stopped perceiving the need, or the pain, or the request. Her perception is as finely calibrated as it has always been. Perhaps more so now that it is no longer constantly overwhelmed by the obligation to act on everything it detects. It stays because what has changed is not what comes in. What has changed is what automatically goes out in response. And the stillness of that changed response, the experience of feeling something and not being immediately moved into service by it, is what genuine equanimity feels like from the inside. Goleman spent years trying to describe this state in language precise enough to distinguish it from its counterfeits. The closest he came, in the research that informed his later thinking on emotional mastery, was this: it is the experience of being fully present to life without being at the mercy of it. Now let's talk about what this means for the relationships in her life, because this is where the final stage of awakening produces its most visible and most misunderstood effects. The first thing that happens is a restructuring of her relational landscape that is so complete, so thorough, and so different from anything that preceded it that the people close to her struggle to find a framework for what they are watching. Because the empath has always been the gravitational center of her social world. Not through any deliberate effort, not through performance or positioning, but simply through the nature of what she brought to every interaction, the quality of her attention, the depth of her understanding, the extraordinary experience of being fully received by someone whose perceptive capacity was turned completely toward you. People organized themselves around her without always realizing they were doing it. They brought their problems to her first. They processed their difficult experiences in her presence because her presence made the processing feel possible. They reached for her when they were struggling, in the automatic way that people reach for the thing that has always made struggling more bearable. And now the empath, standing in her equanimity, is no longer organizing herself around being reached for. She is no longer available in the way she was available before. Not physically absent, not cold, not visibly changed in any way that most people can immediately articulate, but differently present in a way that registers before it is understood. The gravitational pull is different. The automatic orientation toward other people's needs has shifted, and the people who were most organized around her availability, who had most thoroughly incorporated her automatic responsiveness into the structure of how they managed their own emotional lives, feel the shift the way you feel a change in air pressure in the body before the mind has finished processing what has changed. Some of them will name this as her becoming selfish. This is the most common misreading and the most painful one for the empath to encounter, because selfishness is precisely what she is not engaged in. Selfishness is the prioritization of the self at the expense of genuine care for others. What the empath is doing is something categorically different. She is developing a relationship with herself that is no longer structured entirely around self-sacrifice, which is not the same thing as not caring about others. It is the development of the capacity to care from a place that is no longer hollow, to give from a place that is no longer empty, to be present to other people's pain from a place that is no longer drowning in it. Goleman's framework is explicit on this point, in the passages of his work that are most rarely quoted in popular discussions of emotional intelligence. He argued that sustainable compassion, the kind that actually serves people rather than temporarily soothing them while depleting the person providing it, requires what he called a stable self as its foundation. A self that is not infinitely permeable, a self that has edges, has limits, has the capacity to be fully present without being fully consumed. The empath who has reached the final stage of awakening is not becoming less compassionate. She is becoming compassionate in a way that is finally built on a foundation stable enough to hold it without collapsing. And here is what the relationships that survive this transition reveal about themselves, because not all of them do, and the ones that don't reveal something important in their departure. The relationships that cannot survive the empath's equanimity are the ones that were always, at their core, organized around her automatic responsiveness rather than around genuine mutuality. They were relationships that functioned because she was always available, always absorbing, always willing to carry more than her share of the emotional weight, always able to be relied upon to smooth, soften, manage, and maintain in ways that allowed the other person to never have to develop equivalent capacities of their own. When she stops doing that, not out of withdrawal, not out of punishment, simply out of the genuine internal shift that the final stage of awakening produces, these relationships have nothing left to run on. The dynamic that sustained them is gone, and the people in them, rather than doing the work that would be required to build something new on different terms, frequently exit. Sometimes with anger, sometimes with the language of her having changed in ways they didn't sign up for, sometimes with the particularly painful accusation that she is not the person they thought she was, which is, in a specific and unintended way, completely accurate. She is not the person they thought she was. She never was. She was always more than the role she played in their life. They simply never had to encounter the more of her, because the role was capacious enough, and her willingness to stay inside it consistent enough, that the fuller version of her never had room to fully arrive. The relationships that do survive tell a completely different story. They are the ones built on something that the empath, in her clarity, can now see with a precision she never had before. Genuine reciprocity. Not perfect reciprocity, not a mathematically equal exchange of emotional labor measured and balanced at every interaction, but the genuine, foundational orientation of two people who are actually interested in each other, who show up not because the empath's availability makes showing up easy, but because something real draws them back, regardless of what she is or isn't providing on any given day, who have their own stable selves, their own internal resources, their own capacity to be present without requiring her to manage their presence for them. These people do not experience the empath's equanimity as loss. They experience it as an arrival, as the full version of someone they could always sense was there, but could never quite access, because the empath was always too busy being what everyone needed to fully be what she was. These relationships become, in the aftermath of the final awakening, the richest, most genuinely nourishing connections the empath has ever experienced. Not because they are perfect, but because they are real in a way that the relationships built on her automatic availability never entirely were. Because you cannot be in a fully real relationship with someone who has never been fully present as themselves, and the empath has not been fully present as herself in longer than she can clearly remember. Now let's bring Goleman's framework to its conclusion in this conversation, because there is one final element of what he described as emotional mastery that applies directly to where the empath stands at the end of this awakening. And it is the element that explains why this stage is the final one, rather than simply the next one in an ongoing sequence. Goleman argued that the fully emotionally intelligent person, the person who has developed all 5 domains to genuine maturity, eventually arrives at what he described as a kind of effortlessness that is the opposite of numbness. A state in which the management of emotional information, the navigation of relational complexity, the balancing of deep feeling with clear seeing, no longer requires the conscious effort it required in every earlier stage of development. Not because the person cares less, because the person has integrated the caring so completely into the structure of who they are that it no longer needs to be separately managed. It simply is. They feel what they feel, they see what they see, they choose what they choose, and all of it flows from the same integrated self, without the friction that characterizes every earlier stage of development, where feeling and thinking and choosing were always slightly at war with each other, always requiring mediation, always costing something in the effort to keep them working in the same direction. The empath who reaches this integration is not trying to be compassionate. She simply is compassionate, from a self that is whole enough to let the compassion be genuine rather than compelled. She is not trying to maintain her boundaries. She simply has them, organically, because the self that the boundaries are protecting is finally real enough to be worth protecting. She is not trying to choose wisely in relationships. She simply chooses, from a knowing that is deep enough and clear enough that the choice arrives without the agonizing that preceded every choice in every earlier stage of her life. This is what Goleman meant by the final stage of awakening. This is what the day the empath stops caring actually is. Not the ending of her capacity for love or feeling or connection. The ending of the compulsion that was always underneath it, driving it, distorting it, converting her most extraordinary quality into her greatest vulnerability. The ending of the automatic. The ending of the obligation. The ending of the version of herself that was always giving because she didn't yet know how to be without giving. Who was always available because she didn't yet know who she was in her unavailability. Who was always caring for everyone else because caring for herself felt so foreign, so uncomfortable, so laden with the guilt of a lifetime of conditioning that it was easier, always easier, to pour outward than to turn the care inward where it was most needed and had been waiting the longest. That version of her is done, not because she was broken beyond recovery, because she was finally, completely, at enormous cost and over enormous time, recovered. And what she becomes in that recovery, what stands in the place of the woman who used to give everything automatically to everyone who asked, is something that has no adequate word in a language built around the assumption that an empath's highest expression is her availability. It is something closer to what Goleman spent his career trying to describe and never quite fully captured in any single formulation. A person who feels everything, chooses deliberately, loves genuinely, gives sustainably, sees clearly, and needs nothing from the outside world to confirm that all of it, the feeling and the choosing and the loving and the seeing, is enough, that she is enough, that she has always been enough, and that the day she stopped caring, was never the day she stopped caring at all. It was the day she finally, at long last, started.